Hello, I'm Karen Stathoplos, and today I'm going to be reading you excerpts from More Than You Know by Beth Gutcheon, which is exceptionally scary. I read this book first about 10 or 12 years ago, and it scared me very much. I would put it almost on an equal balance as The Haunting by Shirley Jackson, which is my top scary book of all time. This book has been sitting on a table in the corner of my living room for all those years, and I haven't dared read it again, especially if my husband was going to be awake, because I was just too scared. So I'm going to try to read you, I am going to read you excerpts from it. And what this book is an old woman recalling her youth one summer, and Beth Gutcheon juxtaposes this with the tale of a very ill-advised marriage that happened 100 years before this old woman is telling her story about when she was young. So here we go. My children think I'm mad to come up here in winter, but this is the only place I could tell this story. They think the weather is too cold for me, and the light is so short this time of year. It's true, this isn't a story I want to tell in darkness. It isn't a story I want to tell at all, but neither do I want to take it with me. If you approach Dundee, Maine from inland by daylight, you see that you're traveling through wide reaches of pasture strewn with boulders, some of them great gray hulks as big as a house. There are small but thriving island settlements on the coast of Maine even now, on Swans, Isle aux Hauts, Frenchboro, Vinalhaven, the Cranberry Isles, but no one lives on Beale Island anymore. Where there were open meadows and pastures 100 years ago, now are masses of black-green spruce and fir and Scotch pine, interrupted by alder scrub. Summer people go out there for picnics and such, and so do people from town. And so did I 60 years ago. But I'll never go again. Traces of the town have disappeared almost completely, though it's been gone so short a time. Yet the island has been marked and changed by human habitation as Maine meadows inland were altered by ancient ice. Something remains of the lives that were lived there. When hearts swell and hearts break, the feelings that filled them find other homes than human bodies. The summer I was 17, Boston was pinched and stricken by the Depression, and there had been a polio epidemic the previous year. My father wanted us children out of the city. I don't know, but maybe he wanted to see less of Edith, too. I certainly could have done with less of her. Edith was the only mother I'd ever known, but she was my stepmother. My real mother died when I was a baby. Edith and I did pretty well together when I was little and cute, but things changed when her son Stephen came along. Now that I've raised my own children, I have some sympathy for Edith, and I can imagine there's nothing like having your own little chick to make you want to kick out the great foreign cuckoo who lives in your nest. Whatever the reasons for her and for me, that summer was the worst. I'll have to describe the house to you because it was unusual. That's what Edith liked about it. She liked to have things different. When my father said he wanted us to go to Dundee for the summer, she couldn't think on what grounds to refuse. I'm not sure how it worked, but whether Edith traveled up to Dundee to find a place to rent or whether she did it through the mail, one evening, though, she announced she'd taken a place, an old schoolhouse made into a cottage by two maiden ladies. Nice high ceilings, big windows, big wide open rooms. Edith loved it. The one thing I thought when I first saw that house Edith had rented, it was an odd place for a schoolhouse, down on that point instead of right up in the village. I thought maybe they called it the schoolhouse because one of the ladies who fixed it up had been a school teacher. Mrs. Pease at the library told me that. Don't tell me who you are. You're as pretty as your mother, said Esther Pease when I came in that first afternoon. Are you paying a visit to your grandmother? Oh, we're here for the summer. We're in the White House down on the point. Oh, did you take Miss Hammer's house? I always thought that was a lovely house. Edith Pease was a talker. It's been empty a little time now, Mrs. P said. Miss Fanny Hammer owned it. I took Latin from her, so did your mother. I asked what Miss Hammer was like. Tough as a pitch knot, said Mrs. Pease. She lived there with Miss Kennedy, who drove the town taxi and sold jellies. She died, Miss Kennedy. And Miss Hammer, people were surprised at how undone she was. No one thought she'd been all that kind to Miss Kennedy in life. She stayed on in the house, but she wasn't herself. Nella B. Foss at the post office keeps track of those that live alone. If Miss Hammer didn't come for her mail 2 days in a row, she'd send someone over with a plate of berries or some pickles to call her to the door and make sure she hadn't died. That's how they came to find her after her fall. She fell right down her own stairs, lay there all night. She'd had a shock. They took her to a nursing home, but she never came back to herself. She died soon after. Now, you may have noticed I said just now that Miss Hammer had had a shock. I assumed at the time Mrs. Pease meant a stroke. That's the usual name for it here. But later, I was fairly sure something frightened her down the stairs. I'm sure something tried to. There was something in there that was furious, bitter, that other people were going on with their lives. When I got home that afternoon, I was thinking of going to sit down on the rocks by the water instead of going in, and I looked up and I saw someone in my bedroom. She was standing at the window looking down at me, and I felt a wash of resentment. I didn't want Edith prowling among my things. I knew she had tried to read Stephen's top secret mirror code journal, and I knew she would read my diary if she could find it. I went straight inside, ready to charge up the stairs, but I didn't get any further than the little mudroom because I could see from there that Edith was at the sink scrubbing out cook pans that hadn't been cleaned to her liking. I went back outside. I looked up at my window. There was no one there, but there had been. Who could it have been? The house was wide open. Had I imagined it? Some nights later, Edith was in her bedroom overlooking the sea. It had been a bone-chilling day of gray fog, and the night was thick and black. She had built up the fire in the cook stove in the kitchen so it would heat all night, and she had the radio going in her room. I guess Stephen's light was out. I was in my room, in front, in bed, more because the room was cold than because I was sleepy. Distinctly, I heard the front door just below me open and close. The old-fashioned thumb latch on that door made an unmistakable clacking sound, and it could not possibly open by itself or close. Fear pricked my scalp and down my neck, and my heart began to race. I waited for Edith to come out and investigate. What if there were a burglar in the house? The last thing I wanted to do was leave the safety of my bed, but I was more scared to do nothing. I made myself put my bare feet on the floor and went to the door. Things were absolutely quiet downstairs. I could hear a dark cedar tree scratching the window, but this was a comforting sound. In the downstairs dark, there still hung a faint aroma of cheese from the Welsh rabbit we'd had for dinner. I listened and listened, but nothing changed, nothing moved. Maybe there were rules. Maybe as long as I stood and listened, whoever was downstairs was frozen? But that was ridiculous. Far more likely, I'd heard the sound wrong. It was some other door opening and closing, the sound carried here on the wind across the water. I began to dislike standing at the door in my bare feet and nightgown. I got myself across the floor and back into bed, trying the old rule that it can't get you if you're under the covers. At least my electric lamp burned steadily. And I stared at my book and succeeded in reading the same 2 lines over and over. And there was something. I don't know what it was, but Whitey, the dog who slept on the foot of Stephen's bed, began to growl. I could hear him through the wall. He was making the sound of low menace that comes right before he starts barking. The hair along my arms was standing straight up. Was this room suddenly colder? I was straining to hear something in the upstairs hall, waiting to hear a body with human weight and heft try to make its weight toward me, but I heard nothing except Stephen telling Whitey to hush. Then outside the door, I heard something that seemed like a weapon aimed at my heart. Someone right outside my door began weeping. I was holding my book in front of me like a shield. I stared at the iron doorknob, waiting for it to turn. It never did. Instead, horribly, I suddenly knew that something had passed through the door and was in the room with me. I heard fabric rustle as it crossed the room, then a soft creak of wood. Then the rocking chair by the stove began to move. It made a creaking, squeaking noise on the floor as it started back and forth. It was facing me. Someone was in it, rocking and watching me. I tried to call out, but I had lost the power to use my voice. I got off the bed, meaning to run for the door, but as I did, the chair moved violently and was left rocking. There was a dry, scrabbling sound on the floor like rats and dry leaves. At first, I still couldn't see anyone, and then I could. There was an old woman down on all fours, dragging herself across the floor. She turned and looked at me hatefully with burning, colorless eyes that seemed to have no pupils. I must have screamed loud enough to be heard up in the village from the look on Stephen's face as he banged into my room. Edith was right behind him, and Whitey was barking and barking. I had jumped back onto the bed, and I must have been gibbering. Stephen jumped onto the bed with me, and I clutched him. Even Edith looked frightened. I was all pulled into a ball, hugging my brother. I remember being afraid to touch the walls or floor. "Hannah, what is it? What happened?" I said. "Something was in here." I could hardly make my throat work to speak. "What was?" I said, "Rustling, like rats." I didn't know how to say what I had seen. A woman crawling across the floor. "Crawling?" was all Edith said. Her face had begun to change from alarm to something else. Yes, yes! With her staring at me like that, it was hard to make clear what had happened. Something got into my room. It was in the hall first. Whitey growled. Stephen was pale. He knew it was true. Edith was briefly stymied. "And then what happened?" I told her. She looked at the rocking chair. Naturally, it was now utterly still. "A woman crawling?" she asked again. Edith stared at me and I stared back, wondering what she would say or do. Finally, she said, "Oh, for the love of Pete, Hannah, I know you don't like the house. I get the message, but really, I have enough to deal without you trying to thwart me every step of every day." I was dumbfounded. What was this? A hateful thing that could move through closed doors had rocked in that chair right there and frightened me just about into the nuthatch, and suddenly we were talking about whether I like her house? I did like the house. It was the thing we were sharing it with I had problems with. The next morning, I went out and walked to the village, to the post office. "Why, good morning, young lady," said Mrs. Foss when I came in. She had the most beautiful smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Foss," I said. "How are you this morning, Hannah Gray?" "Mail's taking extra time," Mrs. Foss said cheerfully. "I don't mind," I said. "How are you enjoying things down on the point?" I said things were all right. "You know of Miss Kennedy? She used to live in that house. Oh, she had a terrible time there." She said this mildly. "She did?" "Yes, she used to come in all draggle-tailed some mornings, but Miss Hammer wouldn't let her talk about it." I began to think that maybe Mrs. Foss was some kind of mind reader. "Why wouldn't she?" "I don't know, dear, but Miss Hammer ruled the roost." I said, "Miss Hammer taught at the academy, I gather?" "Yes, she did." "Is that why they call the house a schoolhouse?" Oh, no, dear, Mrs. Foss said. She seemed surprised that I had to ask. That was a schoolhouse. It was the old schoolhouse out to the island. After it was closed, Miss Hammer had it brought across on the ice one winter. Really? Oh, that's quite common around here. That schoolhouse was brought across, and some people in the summer colony, they brought over a barn and made it into their living room. I've never been in it. This was news to me, and suddenly I was full of questions. Of course, there are islands where people stayed. Mrs. Foss had paused in dealing envelopes into slots to read some postcards. Everyone expected this. The truth is, people started to remove from Beale back in the 90s after the murder. The murder, I said. My skin pricked, and I stopped trying to get through to Hoover. Yes, there was a murder out in Beale in 86, was it, Nella? 1886. I'm surprised you haven't heard of it. A girl called Sally Haskell killed her father with an axe. There was a trial up in Unionville. It was a terrible thing to happen in a little island village. Killed her father? Was that what I had seen crawling across the bedroom floor? An old woman who had killed someone once? Was I sure it was a woman? Was it a murdered man? The more I thought of it, the more I thought that I had heard something about it. It was the kind of tale that gets whispered among sleeping bags. A girl murderer, a lonely island. But I certainly didn't know it was this bay or that island. What happened to her, Sally Haskell? Why, they couldn't convict her. They tried her twice. The first time the jury was hung, and the second time they acquitted. Yes, reporters came up from all over New England for the trial. Not many wanted to come back up here for the second one. What happened to Sally afterwards? She came back here, they both said. But she didn't go back to the island. She stayed in Dundee where she had family and lived in a little house by herself. I was growing afraid to ask more about her. Two nights later, my brother Stephen went to sleep with gum in his mouth. He woke up with gum all through his hair. Edith was so mad, she cut his hair short and said it would teach him a lesson. I asked him if he would feel better if I had short hair too. At first he just looked gloomy, and then I said maybe we could get the whole town to cut their hair, even Mrs. Foss and Mr. Horton and even the coon cat that slept on the windowsill. The town would be famous. We'd be in all the news rules. He finally started to laugh. Well, then I had to make good on it. We went into the hall bathroom between his bedroom and mine. He stood on a stool beside me so I could look at his shorn forelock while I cut my own so we would match. I combed a hank of hair over my face. My hair wasn't like Stephen's. Mine was dense and straight. I felt for my eyebrows with my finger and cut with the scissors flat across my forehead, and then I could see with one eye. I met Stephen's eyes in the mirror. He was aghast with delight that I had really done it. I positioned the scissors carefully, taking care not to poke myself in the eye. I felt Stephen was holding his breath, watching what I was doing. Slice! The blade cut through my hair, and suddenly there I was, transformed. Stephen was looking with amazement at my new face in the mirror and seeing nothing else. But my heart nearly stopped. Now in the mirror, I could see a tall, black-shrouded figure just outside the door in the hall, silently watching us. It had arrived soundlessly and was hovering, intent, as if it didn't know it could be seen, its face shaded except for terrible, piercing eyes, a gaze like ice picks. I screamed, dropped the scissors into the sink, and all the electric lights in the house went out.